Stanford University.
Welcome to the 2020 Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, and it's a pleasure to be with you in community for this session in our second day of the summit. It is an honor and pleasure to introduce you to this session's speaker. Dr. Magali Fassiotto is Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Diversity at Stanford University School of Medicine. She has worked in organizational change and organizational management for 15 years in the private, government, and educational sectors. She manages the School of Medicine's efforts in professional development activities, strategic initiatives related to the recruitment and retention of a diverse and inclusive faculty, and research related to faculty development and diversity. And she is giving us a session on becoming conscious of unconscious bias, contemplative practices to strengthen respect and inclusion in the workplace. We give a warm welcome to you in our silent Zoom room, but there's applause happening, and we look forward to this time with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tia, and thank you to everyone here. I am really looking forward to our session together today. So as was mentioned, we'll be talking about unconscious bias and thinking about ways to become aware of our biases in a more systematic way to really create an environment of respect and inclusion around us. And so we use the word unconscious and conscious bias. It sounds a little bit like we're comatose and something is happening to us, and that's not quite the case, but I hope that we will learn together today about what these words mean and what we can do about them. So I'm going to start actually with a brief imagery exercise. And so I'm going to ask you to clear your mind, close your eyes, and imagine the individuals I'm about to describe. So I'll go through a couple, so please keep your eyes closed until I tell you to open them again. And I'd want you to provide a lot of context to these individuals. Where are they? What do they look like? What are they wearing? And so we'll get started. So I want you to think of a gay man. He is of Japanese ancestry. He is the father of two. And he just celebrated his 82nd birthday. All right, clear your mind. I'm going to describe another individual. I want you to think of a world-class athlete. He is a white male. He is an engineer. And he requires a wheelchair for mobility. All right, clear your mind. This is the last individual. I want you to think of a single mother. She is a Black woman. She is very wealthy. And she is a famous author. All right, you can open your eyes. That last one actually describes Maya Angelou, and I'm wondering if anyone thought of her. I've been in several sessions where someone will say, that's who I was thinking of, and so that one actually described her, so congratulations. But I'd like to pause here, and actually this might be an overwhelm in the chat box, but I'd love for people to just type in who they were thinking of. For any of the three, who were you thinking of? It could be, you know, my mom, my best friend, just anyone that you were thinking of. So someone said Shonda Rhimes, so someone from the media. Sulu or George Takei. Actually, that was an interesting one. You can keep typing them in. I was in a workshop once and someone said, you know, that first one, I started off with George Takei, and then I went to, or I started off with Neil Patrick Harris, and then I went to George Takei. And it's funny how our mind was able to shift that way, but that also exemplifies that we were thinking of, you know, someone from the media, and we sort of stuck with that and went for someone from the media as well. Someone said Oprah, and it's not necessarily that all of the qualifiers existed for her, but we thought of her in one of those and really just stuck with that. That was exemplified. I had someone in a workshop once who said, I thought of LeBron James when you said world-class athlete. And then I said, yeah, but then it said white male. And he said, yeah, but then I was just thinking about LeBron James and I wanted to keep thinking about LeBron James. And I said, great, that's wonderful. We're seeing Bruce Lee, Toni Morrison. Someone said, you know, someone I knew personally in a previous chapter of my life, someone I've had a connection with. And so what we're seeing is that, you know, my best friend, Larry Bird, Oprah, I love these. So, you know, what we're seeing here is that we're seeing people that we know, either that we know personally or that we know from the media. And this is actually what informs our biases. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So bear with me 1 second. There we go. And let me make this full screen for you all. All right. I hope you can all see the screen now. And so what it was showing was that we were really thinking of people that we either know personally or that exist in the media around us. And these can really be anybody, and it's people we know, and that's informing the pictures that we have. You know, I was in a large meeting once, and they said, you know, what was really hard for me was going from world-class athlete to engineer. And I said, oh, that's so interesting because I live in Silicon Valley and everyone is an engineer. And so that's not a big leap of faith for me to make. But, you know, if you're living somewhere else and that's not what you're seeing around you, then that can actually be a tough shift. So the other thing that happened there was that our brains shifted tremendously from one person to the next. And it's interesting what our brains are able to do. So what were our brains doing? They created an image of a person based on very limited information. And we do that in everyday life. So we are constantly doing that. And it's interesting because when we think about people, so if we're thinking about, for example, George Takei, then we might actually attribute something to that person who is not George Takei that we associate with George Takei, and then that actually is an error in decision-making and can lead us down a wrong decision-making path. So we created this image of a person based on very limited information. We made certain assumptions that were not based on fact. They might be based on stereotype or our understanding of the world. And we use stereotypes. So this is where we get into that idea around unconscious. The images that we created happened sort of automatically. We weren't even aware that they were happening. It was a way for our brains to save cognitive energy. So what happens with unconscious bias is that our brain needs to make decisions, needs to understand things very quickly. And what our brains will do is they will try to limit the amount of information they have to process at any one time. So we might hear, you know, all-star athlete, and then we go, oh, LeBron James, or oh, Larry Bird, and then we stick with that so that we don't have to process too much energy. And so this is evolutionarily adaptive because our brain has to process so much information at any one time that we want to use ways to collapse the amount of information that we need to process. Now, where this can lead us wrong in the social world is that we're using stereotypes. We're not actually using real behavioral or other characteristics of an individual when we're making decisions or when we are talking with these individuals. And so that is where our brains can sort of lead us astray. So we talked about these as cognitive shortcuts, and that is a type of cognitive error. So what are some types of cognitive shortcuts and cognitive errors? We talked briefly just now about stereotypes. So that is a major one. this is, they're easily accessible and they're all around us and we use them to make inferences and judgments. They're also biased blind spots. So this is where we see other people's biases, but not our own. So this is similar to situations where you say, he's so racist, she's so sexist, but I am, I'm perfect. We see other people's biases, but we don't recognize our own. There are in-group biases when we prefer people who are similar to ourselves. So for example, there is a lot of research in the social network world that shows a lot of homophily. That means we really associate with people who are similar to ourselves. And this can be detrimental for example, in a work setting, in a hiring setting, where we're hiring clones and we're not actually expanding the knowledge that's there. There's confirmation bias, where we ignore information that comes in. We've set on a certain hypothesis, and then new information comes in, and we ignore that information because it doesn't fit with our hypothesis. And then finally, the one I want to talk about today was also groupthink. We've all been in this situation in work and school settings where the group seems to be barreling down a path. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking, that's not really how I would have done this. But if that's what everyone else thinks we should be doing, then they're clearly right. So I will just follow along. So I wanted to do another sort of exercise to get at this idea around what bias is and how it might influence us. So I want everyone to take a look at the picture on your screen, and you need to sort of memorize it because I'm going to ask you in another slide to answer a question about it, and you won't have this picture. So if you look at the picture, I want you to look at the squares A and B and think to yourself, which square is darker? Is square A darker or is square B darker? So look at the picture, make your decision. So here were the results. We had the majority were square A, and then we had a small percentage for square B, and then we had about 30% for square C. So most people, as we saw in our poll everywhere, most people saw that square A was several shades darker in color than square B. But the bars here show that actually square A and square B are the exact same shade of gray. So what was happening? The illusion that B is lighter in color actually happens because of the checkerboard pattern. There's this contrast that is happening on the screen, as well as the fact that our brain is compensating for the fact that this green cylinder appears to be casting a shadow on the board. So our brain is compensating for both this checkerboard and the green cylinder at the same time without us even being aware. We don't even know that this is happening. And so if we apply this to the social world, the cognitive shortcuts that we take, such as stereotypes, in-group bias, they're like the green cylinder that can cast shadows and lead us to different conclusions when we're making decisions. I hope that that is a nice sort of example of how our biases operate in this way that our brain is really taking these cognitive shortcuts. So we think about where do biases come from? And as we saw from our imagery exercise, biases can come from media. So we're affected by what we hear and see from the media. We are affected by what we hear from friends, family, coworkers. They really come from everywhere. They are around us all the time, and really anything can affect them. They can be activated at all times as well. And the important thing to remember here is this means that we tend to share the same biases across cultural environments. For example, there are several strong national biases we might share, and even very strong regional biases that people might share. So when we think about what activates our biases, we talked about how bias is really a cognitive shortcut. It's saving cognitive energy. This means that our biases are going to be activated when we're trying to save cognitive energy. So this might be when we're under stress, when we experience time constraints, when we're multitasking, when we experience a need for closure. So really, all the time, particularly at work, and probably in many of our very busy lives at home as well. So this means that our biases are there all the time. And at this point, you might say, well, it's unconscious. There's nothing I can do about it. Let me go home. And this is where I say, not so fast. This is where we can start to reflect on our own personal selves and think about how then can we make our biases conscious or become aware of our biases to really minimize their impact on our daily life and on social decision making. So, how many of you have taken the implicit association test? And I'm thinking the way that you can tell me is if you raise your hand in the participant box, there should be an option for you to just raise your hand in the participation box. And there we go. Great. So quite a lot of you have taken the implicit association test. That is wonderful. So for those of you who have not, I would highly recommend this. You go to the website, it's actually implicit.harvard.edu. And the implicit association test is useful really for one major reason. We've talked about how biases can exist outside of our conscious awareness. And the implicit association test is actually a test that psychologists have developed to measure our implicit biases. We call it the IAT for short, and what it does is it measures the time it takes for you to associate one concept, for example, women, with another concept, for example, science, and the quicker you can associate these two concepts together, the stronger your implicit bias is thought to be. So it's important to remember that scores on the IAT do not necessarily correlate with explicit behavior, and that's actually a good thing. But what it can be really useful for is informing your own biases and informing yourself. So this is sort of contemplative tip number 1 today, to really seek out opportunities to explore your biases, to understand, do this self-reflection, take these tests, think about how you might explore these biases in your everyday life. All right. So these are some results from the implicit association test across the tens of thousands of people that have taken it over the past 20 years that has been in existence. So this is the one for associating names with names associated with women versus names associated with men, and you associate that with concepts that are associated with science versus concepts associated with liberal arts. And we see that this is actually a global test with stronger demographic participation in the United States, but a global test. And we see that there is this predominant narrative and prominent tendency to associate men with science and women with liberal arts. Now, it's true that there are these groups, these pockets, some people who have no automatic association in either direction, and this small group that has the reverse. And perhaps those people, since it's informed by our environments, those people had parents who were mothers who were scientists, or daughters or sisters who were scientists that really shaped their perceptions. Similarly, this is an IAT that measures racial preference on the same site, implicit.harvard.edu. And what this test did is it had people associate faces that were either associated with Black appearing features, Black American appearing features, or white American appearing features. And they had them associate them with words that were either considered pleasant or unpleasant. So an example of pleasant words would be smile, honest, sincere. Unpleasant words might be disaster or agony. And they measured how quickly people could pair those concepts together. And again, we see this predominant tendency to associate white American words with pleasant and Black American words with unpleasant. So what does this actually mean? Where does this show up? How can it show up? So I'm going to start with some research studies that have come along. So this was a study that was published about 5 years ago in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was actually a bit controversial when it was published, and there were a lot of letters back and forth about whether we should believe these results. But the authors stood by their claim and said, no, we actually believe these results to the full extent. And what the authors did in this study is they looked at hurricanes over the past 50 or 60 years and the names of hurricanes. So they had a group of raters rate how masculine or how feminine the hurricane names were. And they rated them on this masculinity femininity index. So a low MFI meant that the name was particularly masculine, and a high MFI meant that the name was more feminine. And then separately from that rating process, they looked at normalized damage. So they looked at predicted fatality counts from those hurricanes, and they associated the two. And what they found is that hurricanes with more feminine names caused much more damage over the past 50 or 60 years than hurricanes with more masculine sounding names. So what is the mechanism for this? Hurricanes are sort of named after or are named before they cause the damage. So we don't, it's not that scientists are named, it's not the naming convention of the scientists. So what is going on there? They did some laboratory experiments to sort of see what was going on there. And one of the conclusions, one of the mechanisms they came up with is that when people were faced with a masculine sounding name coming to them, they were much more likely to take it seriously, to prepare, to either evacuate, get their canned goods, board up windows, whereas when they saw a more feminine hurricane coming, they took her less seriously, and it then caused more damage. So I see there's a question there about how long we've been using both gender hurricanes, and I actually have the answer to that. It was actually in the 1970s that we actually switched to have both male and female names, and they alternated back and forth. So this is another study that's been done several times, also since the 1970s, and you may have seen the results of this. So this is the Draw a Scientist test. And what they do is they go to school-age children and they ask them to draw a scientist. And then researchers go in and look at, how many women scientists are drawn and how many men scientists are drawn. And the results have been pretty consistent over the past several decades. There is this tendency for children, when they are asked to draw a scientist, to draw a male scientist. And in this particular study, we see that in K through second grade, the tendency is a little lower. You would expect if we were at parity that it would be 50-50. But, the K through second graders are at 58. But then by the time they hit third grade, 3/4 of them are drawing male scientists. And this has been replicated multiple times. But what I love about this is that we think this is another situation where we throw our hands up and say, oh, there's nothing we can do. But what researchers did is they actually did the study. They got the same results. And then they took the kids the next day to a lab, a science lab, and they had the kids meet the scientists. And the kids met women and men. They met people of different race ethnicities. They met, people with tattoos, people not wearing lab coats, pocket protectors, people that were not wearing glasses. And then the next day, they had the children come back to class, draw a scientist. And who did the children draw? They drew the people they had met the day before. So this really shows the importance of really opening our minds and expanding who we think of when we think about these very stereotyped professions. Our biases also appear in the hiring arena, as you might well imagine. This is a study that has also been replicated several times over the past decades, and across gender and race as well. And what they do is they create identical CVs. And in this case, they had two versions of the CV. One was a bit more low quality and one was high quality. They had these identical CVs and they randomized if they put a white sounding name or a black sounding name on the CV. And then they send the CV to job opportunities, job ads across certain cities. So this one was done in Boston and Chicago. And what they found is that the callback rate for the low quality CVs was the same. It wasn't that great. They weren't called back. But the callback rate for the high quality CVs, there was a substantial difference, and the white sounding names were called back at a much higher rate. And I like to point this one out because I'm at a place like Stanford and we think, oh, we only think about things objectively. If it's a high quality CV, we are only judging it on its merit. But this is actually showing the reverse, that it's actually only in the instances of the high quality CV that we're seeing these discrepant results. And as Tia mentioned, I am in the School of Medicine, so I do like to bring in how this affects patient care as well. This is a study that has also been replicated multiple times, and it around pain medication and tendencies to prescribe pain medication. So this was for pediatric patients who were presenting to emergency rooms with appendicitis. And what the researchers did is they looked at who was presenting with a moderate amount of pain first. And they found that when children were presenting to the ED with a moderate amount of pain, there was this substantial difference in being prescribed pain medication. White pediatric patients were much more likely to be prescribed any pain medication than black pediatric patients. There was no difference for opioids because that would be a much stronger pain medication for the moderate pain scenario. Then they looked at those presenting with severe pain, and they found that white and black children were equally likely to be prescribed pain medication. But for this severe amount of pain, the white children were much more likely to be prescribed an opioid than the Black children. And so what is this showing us? I think it's showing us that physicians may subconsciously require a higher pain threshold to administer opioids to Black children with appendicitis. And this is not conscious. They're not, they're not being racist. I think it's happening in the subconscious. And that's sort of where we really want to pay attention to do this kind of work. So I want to pause there. Actually, maybe I'll stop here, pause there, and see if there are any questions that we should think about just now.
So the question is, I'd like to offer a different perspective. I would define the doctor's actions in the last slide as actually racist. It's not conscious racism, but the impact is racist. So that's a comment more than a question.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that when we hear the word biases, we may think it doesn't have, and we're going to get to impact in a little bit, but we may think that the impact is more minor. Bias may make it sound like this is some sort of minor impact, but it may not actually have a minor impact. And so I think maybe that's what that comment was getting at, and I 100% agree.
Thank you, Magali. The next question is, what is the difference between bias in systems and bias in individuals?
Oh, I love this question. And so I think they actually are cut from the same cloth. So when we think about individual biases, we're thinking about things that happen on a one-to-one basis in a one-to-one scenario. And when we think about systemic biases, we think about processes that are baked into the system. So, for example, in the hiring world, it might be only sending job advertisements to certain places that don't really have diverse applicant pools. And so that would be a systemic bias. However, the reason I say they're kind of cut from the same cloth is that it's actually individuals who tend to create the systems. And so it's actually up to individuals to change the systems and to work at disrupting those systems that have these systemic biases baked into them. I really love that question, but I think, they're very, they're tied to one another. It's just that when we think about systemic biases, that is how our biases then become replicated over time, over and over again, so that the same biases are just reappearing.
And that is the last question that's posted at this time.
Thank you so much. So let's continue. So I want to get into now about addressing bias. So it's true, we've talked about, we all have these biases. So what do? We can't control other people necessarily, except for that question around the systemic biases. We can't necessarily control other people's actions. We can try to change systems, and that's something we should all be thinking about in our daily lives. What systems are we a part of that we can analyze for bias? But around personal bias, what we can really do is be aware. We talked about that contemplative tip number 1, be aware, become aware, and think about when your biases are appearing as intuition or gut reactions. It can be systematic, so using concrete guidelines or checklists. So for example, in that doctor scenario, it could be anyone who we perceive to have pain level above this certain threshold, this is what we will prescribe everybody. And then finally, you really want to be open, continue to self-educate, continue to learn in this sphere. So one way that bias manifests is through what are called microaggressions. And so microaggressions have become kind of popular in the media over the past several years, but it is an academic concept dating back again to the 70s. I feel like the research really blossomed in the 70s. But microaggressions are really everyday slights, snubs, and insults, both intentional and unintentional, which communicate hostile or offensive messages to target individuals based on marginalized group identities. So we have some examples here, but I'll get into more depth about examples on the next slide. But I think the point here is really that it's around intentional and unintentional. It really encompasses all of that. And we are going to talk a little bit about what intentional means and then what that means for the actual impact. So here are some examples of microaggressions. I won't go through all of them, but I would love to just take us through a couple so that you can sort of see, what you said, what does it feel like you said? So this first, where are you from? The intent there may be, well, I'm curious, I want to know more about you. But the impact there to someone who gets this question every day, some of us might get this question once every 5 years, and some of us might get this question every day. And the impact to someone who's getting that every day is, you're not like me, you're different from me. You're not me. You're not one of us. When I look at you, I don't see color, or there is only one race, the human race. The intent there actually may be quite positive. It might be to say, I don't want to let biases cloud my judgment. I view us all as equal. The impact to someone, though, might be to feel that you're denying the person's, cultural heritage or cultural background, and kind of denying societal facts. So it sort of denies the existence of biases based on color or based on race. And so this can be very impactful in that we're saying, I don't recognize these biases. This one we hear all about in the workspace setting. A colleague speaks only to the male, white, or older appearing individual in the room. So, this could be, on the intent really could be, I want to hear from the person with the most experience. And the impact to the woman or person of color or younger appearing person in the room is that I'm not worth their time. I'm just not important enough. I'm not worth their time. So I want us to take these sort of ideas around what microaggressions are and reflect for a moment. We're going to do another poll everywhere, so I'm going to switch screens. But I want to reflect for a moment about, in the past month, think about what you most recently recall, and I'll show the prompt here, and then I'll go to the other screen. So you can say, in the past month, I can most recently recall having, and you can choose A, having been the target of a microaggression, having witnessed a microaggression, C, having committed a microaggression, or D, none of the above. Oh, we're seeing quite a few individuals recall having been the target of a microaggression. I think this is the one that sticks with us the most. This is that we identify when we have been on the receiving end of those microaggressions. There is, about a quarter of us have witnessed a microaggression. So we've witnessed this happening in the past month. And, a few brave souls have admitted to recognizing that they've committed a microaggression or having been told that they committed a microaggression. I think we're pretty stable here. I think this is so interesting because what it really shows is that we have that impact. We get that impact on ourselves, and we recognize, sorry, I'm going to move my screen over. We recognize the impact on ourselves, but we also recognize the impact on other people. It is hard to be self-reflective, and that's really what we really need to think about, is how do we become a bit more self-reflective about when we've committed a microaggression. Because if all of these microaggressions are happening, people are committing them, and we are probably a part of the problem. And a quarter of us don't actually even recognize having seen it or witnessed it in the past month. And we'll talk a little bit about this phenomenon as well. We've been talking mostly about microaggressions, and that's really because it's 90% of the time that's what we see around us. There are also what we might call macroaggressions, or what we perceive as more outrageously racist or sexist, or this more outrageous bias that we see around us. And in reality, I want to propose to you today, in reality, there may be less distinction between the two than we might think. And macroaggression is not really a technical term. It's sort of playing on this word of microaggression, but to sort of get that point across. In the case of these microaggressions, the really key thing here is they may actually be difficult to identify, particularly if you don't share the same identity group as the target. If you don't have the same background, you may not even recognize something as a microaggression, and that's where self-education and self-awareness really comes into play to continue to be on the lookout. In the case of these more egregious bias cases, they're hard to address because they can often make everyone uncomfortable, and we all tend to freeze. And they become just harder to address because we just don't know what to do. And the thing about both of them is that they both may cause impact or harm. If someone is hearing the same microaggression thousands of times in a year, you can bet that it's going to have a large impact on that person. So that gets to the idea here around intent versus impact. The way bias operates is that an individual may have a certain intent. They enact some behavior, and that behavior has an impact. That impact may then have the intended consequences or the unintended consequences. In the case of microaggressions, it could have intended or unintended consequences. And what we need to focus on is the fact that it has this impact on someone. Regardless of the intent, the biased behavior has had an impact on someone. So that's sort of our contemplative tip number 2 today, is that we want to acknowledge intent, but our focus is on impact. We want to focus on what has happened to the individual, what they are feeling in that moment. So this is key really to the whole discussion around bias and its impact on folks. You know, when we have been told that we have committed a microaggression or we recognize it through self-awareness and education, what do? The first thing we want to do is acknowledge intent, but focus on impact. Consider the other person's past experiences and how, you know, we just didn't know. You may not have known. I'm going to assume that it was an unintentional microaggression here. Next, you really want to own your actions. You want to acknowledge that your actions were biased, even if you were not aware. Acknowledge the impact that it had on the other person and own the consequences. Apologize. And then finally is this reinforce and repair. You want to reach out and rebuild trust, and that may not happen right away. But if you work at it, I think it's something that you can sort of, this is its own self-process of reinforcing and repairing yourself. And you want to focus on reinforcing behaviors that prevent the bias from happening in the future. And this gets back to that earlier question around systemic versus individual bias. Something that may appear as an individual bias, you can actually work on to ensure that it doesn't appear again, because it's sort of built into you. It's a systemic bias even within. And if you can work towards repairing that or not allowing it to appear in the future, that can really go a long way. So the next piece is addressing bias we see. On that poll everywhere chart we did, we saw that, you know, people had experienced microaggressions. And then the second was really having witnessed a microaggression. Now, what I did not ask, and what we could ask in the future, is what did you do when you witnessed that microaggression? So when we are in a room and we witness this microaggression happening, what do? We witness bias happening. What do we do? So we don't want to be a simple bystander. The bystander effect describes a situation where someone stands back and does nothing. And the reason for that is usually 2 reasons. One, there are social norms that stop us from intervening. That's just not what's done. Or 2, we think someone else will take care of it. It's not my duty to take care of it. Someone else will take care of this in the moment. What we want to do is we want to be upstanders. So an upstander, I'm also calling this an active bystander, is a person who stands up, speaks out, and or takes action in defense of those who are targeted for harm or injustice. The important thing to remember is that silence is viewed as endorsement. If you were silent when you witness these behaviors, it's really viewed by others around you as endorsing the behavior. And what we say, particularly in the workplace setting, is that when you are in a position of power in the workplace, silence is really viewed as endorsement. And so it is incumbent upon folks in positions of power to address the behavior as they see it. Now, you can address it directly, and direct can actually be really good, particularly when you're in the position of power and you don't want to make this a cultural norm that bias can just happen in this workplace. But depending on context, you may also want to follow up. And the important thing about follow-up, and we'll get at this a little bit on the next slide, but the important thing about follow-up is that you want to follow up both with the target of the microaggression as well as the person who committed the microaggression. So when you address bias, there's really 3 goals. 3 goals. So first is to offer support for the target. You know, make them recognize that they're not crazy. You heard it too. You know, what can I do? I heard that. I can't believe that that person said that. I can't believe that was said. I can't believe that happened. How can I support you? And then the second piece I said, which is the piece we often forget and don't do, is to bring awareness for the offender. In the case of intentional bias, we want to make the offender aware that that type of behavior is not tolerated here. In the case of unintentional biased behavior, you want to let the person know of the impact their actions had and let them know that it actually could have been perceived under a lens of bias. And I think this is really important because it gets to our point around self-improvement. And then finally, you want to bring systemic attention to the problem? Are there ways we can bake into the system so that this type of biased behavior doesn't happen in the future? So this is our contemplative tip number 3, is to really be an active bystander and seek out opportunities to address microaggressions as they happen. Now, I do want to caveat here that you don't want to be the savior that comes in. It's not really the savior role. It's sort of addressing, environments of disrespect in the workplace and addressing environments of bias in the workplace. It's not about saving the target individual or saving anyone else. So in this last section, I want us to think about ways that we can build diverse environments around us. So I think this is going to be our last poll everywhere activity, but I am going to ask you in one word to name a social identity with which you identify.
So one question is, if the offender is your boss, what do you recommend?
So yeah, that is a great question. And so we've actually been working with a lot of groups here around just those situations. And there's 2 different answers I can give. And one, again, I loved that initial question around individual versus systemic. So there's 2 different answers here. One is really the individual, and that is thinking about, is this a safe space? What is this environment? Can I approach the individual and let them know about the impact? And it sounds like because of this question, maybe that's not the case, but that's always really the preferred mechanism. Can I say, I don't think you meant it this way? And there's another question. I have a personal question here about how you might tell someone about an unintentional bias. And you can say, I know you probably didn't mean it this way, but it really came off sounding a little bit sexist or a little bit biased or whatever the case may be. And I just want to let you know because I really don't think you meant it that way. And that can be sort of a kind way to say that, but to really make it clear. So that's sort of the individual level. And the systemic level, we've been working with a lot of teams here to think about this from the outset, because biased behavior is going to happen. Microaggressions will happen, whether intentional or unintentional. In the workplace, it can be really useful to have a system of, and it doesn't necessarily need to be reporting, but a system for talking about these issues. And so there can be 2 or 3 different people identified in a workplace setting as sort of the receiver of this information, the receiver of reports. And you want to make sure it's not just one person, because if it's one person, if the problem is with that one person, then there's sort of a problem there. And so you want to think about 2 or 3 people that might be the receiver of information, and then they actually have we call this an algorithm or flow chart, steps of what happens next. Who do they talk to next? Are they in a position of power where they may be able to speak to the boss? And then they also want to talk with you about whether you want to be identified in that process. And so I think you want to work within your teams to make sure that there are these processes developed before it's too late, so that you can make sure that you actually have a process in place as you move forward. And if that doesn't exist for you yet, then I would seek out option number 3, which is to seek out an ally who may be able to talk about it with the boss. And I think you don't want to remain silent, because these are the things that really stick with us. And in the case of unintentional microaggressions, you want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I think that if we educate others, we can really work to not make it happen again. In the case of intentional, maybe you need to get HR involved to make sure that they know that this type of behavior is not tolerated here. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think there are so many different approaches there that it kind of merited that.
Thank you very much for a thorough response. And related to that, there were some questions asking whether you know if areas outside of the School of Medicine are also addressing the kind of systemic correction and resources that you were just referencing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love to think that we're doing it all, but I think there's this conversation going across the university. So in the staff arena, there is the Ideal Engage program, and managers are being trained on this, and they actually have resources and toolkits available to everybody about how to address bias that we see. Another wonderful resource is the VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. And they actually work with corporate partners outside of Stanford, but they use research-based methods to address bias in the workplace. And they actually have a bunch of toolkits available. And then, of course, there are conversations happening within the student-run organizations within campus that can also be a great resource in this situation.
Do you know of any centralized website where those resources are already posted? And if it doesn't exist, we'll do our best to make them available to everyone who attended today.
Yeah, I don't think we have, I may be wrong, so if I am wrong, someone can write this in the chat box, but I don't think that we have a centralized resource with all of those toolkits. But that is a great idea, and I'd be happy to help with that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have
All right.
one last
Yes.
question, and that is how can we respond to those who scoff at terms like microaggression and politically correct, saying people who use those terms are just picky and controlling?
Yeah, and this is a great question. Language can be touchy for everyone. And so we can really just describe it for what it is. This is a statement that was disrespectful in the workplace, a statement of disrespect. And you can describe it for what it is. I would say, try not to get too hung up on the words that we use. This was an expression of bias in the workplace. This was an expression of disrespectful workplace. This was not an environment of inclusion. I think you don't need to, from my perspective, and others may have different perspectives, but from my perspective, we don't need to get hung up on the language. We don't need to get hung up on the words. We need to really get hung up on the impact that it's having on others. So I think that's a great question. All right, so I'm going to share the social identities that people posted here. I love this chart. So we see, this is the social identities with which we identify. We see a lot of women, female, Jewish, disabled, colleague, parent, Christian, Vietnamese, I like that, Democrat, Korean. This is so wonderful because it exhibits like a ton of different factors. So we have a lot of demographic characteristics. We have, environmentalist, swimmer. So we have beliefs or belief systems, activities that we're a part of. Let's see. Yeah, well, and it keeps changing, which I love even more. I love this, and I think we should save this, and maybe I can give it to you for like a sort of a summary of the summit. Tia, I think that would be really lovely to see, like, how do people identify who are here? And so I think the main point of this activity is really to show that we all have so many different aspects of our social identity. And this is contemplative tip number 4, to be aware of the social identities that we bring to our spaces and to make sure that we're aware of how we're showing up and how others perceive that social identity that we're bringing into a space. So I love this, and I think I'll take a picture or I'll take a PDF and send it over so that you have it for posterity. So getting to the point that we earlier saw was that there are so many different ways for us to describe our identity. And what is most common is that we tend to focus on our more marginalized identities because those are the ones that really stand out to us. The ones where we feel like we're in the minority of a group, and that is what is most prominent on our minds and oftentimes on the minds of others that we interact with. But this is a research from a Harvard Business Review article that showed that there's really 3 different types of diversity that shape our identities. There's demographic diversity, which is, your identities of origin, and we saw a lot of that in our beautiful word chart. And then there are experiential diversity, so identities of growth, and this can be the hobbies that we do. So we had swimmer in one of them, affinities, we had vegetarian in one of them. And so I think that these are based on our life experiences, and they are also the ways we show up at the table. And then the third one here is cognitive diversity. So this is identities of aspiration, how we approach problems and think about things. So it could be the academic discipline that you have studied or that you know a lot. It could be the way you approach different problems. I'm a risk taker. I'm risk averse. It could just be different types of ways that you approach given situations. And so again, you know, this tip number 4 is really reflecting on your own social identities and how they show up in the workplace. So this really leads to the final point I have here, and that is, how do we focus on building inclusive communities? How can we promote inclusive spaces moving forward? So the first thing, and since people were asking about work, I assume that this is also top of mind, and it's true, it is hard to think about work right now, particularly when we are remote, but we're seeing the same sorts of biases or ideas around how do we build respectful remote workplaces, how do we build inclusive remote workplaces. But I just want to say that it's still a topic of conversation. It's just different how we approach it. We want to think about the environment that we're working in. Now, this example is not remote, but I do have a good example here. There are a lot of research studies that show the environment in which we exist has a large influence on whether we feel if we belong. So the reason there's these pictures of these 3 scientists here is that there has been a lot of research around just the pictures that are up on the wall. And so these pictures are actually taken of about, I think Google heard my talk. I don't think they did, but I say that because about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, if you type the word scientist into Google, these were the first pictures that popped up. It was actually a series of 10 pictures, and they were dead, mostly white males. There was one woman, it was Marie Curie, but it was also in black and white. And those were the pictures that showed up when you typed the word scientist into Google. Now, if you type the word scientist into Google, I think they've changed their algorithms for the better, which is great. You have pictures of modern people, all different race, ethnicities, different genders. And so that is just one piece. You know, if I can't think of myself as a scientist, why am I going to go into science? And there's actually research that shows, there was research out of the University of Washington where they put freshmen who had declared that they had an interest in computer science. And they put them in a computer science room and had them fill out a survey. And one of the questions was, you know, how likely are you to major in computer science? And what they found is that they put half of the people in rooms that had stereotypical male things around. So there were Star Trek and Star Wars posters and actually this was considered stereotypically male, but they had, you know, like trash on the ground, like food wrappers. I apologize to you know, the clean men out there, but that was one of the things they put in this room. And then they had another where they just had landscape paintings around the room. And what they found is that in the room with the stereotypically male features, women were much less likely to write that they wanted to pursue this scientific degree. When they were in the room with the landscapes, they were much more likely to write that. And we see this all around us, even if I'm in the School of Medicine again, and even in the School of Medicine, you have, you know, walls of endowed professors or walls of former deans, and they all have this certain look. And if you are walking in and you're saying, oh, I don't really belong, I can't be a dean, I can't be an endowed professor, that doesn't look like me, that can go a long way towards not building that inclusive community that you want to build. So the second piece here is around space for ideas. You want to make sure in team meetings, in any space that you're in, that you allow all voices and ideas to be heard and to be explored. We talked earlier about groupthink. When everyone is bringing the same ideas to the table, it really diminishes our potential as a group. And finally, we want to focus on building communities of respect. So teams thrive and innovations occur when different ideas are brought to the table in a respectful manner. And it shows, when we talked about our social identities on the previous slide, there's a lot of research that shows that actually teams that are made up of folks from different social identities actually have better, more innovative ideas because they're bringing different backgrounds and life experiences to the table. So that's my tip number 5, to really focus in your own space on how to build inclusive communities. So that's my final content slide, and I wanted to just summarize here and say, you know, how do we become conscious of our unconscious biases? What are the activities that we can do in our everyday life? So first, you want to seek out opportunities to explore your biases in everyday life. This could be through, for example, the implicit association test. This could be through self-education, you know, reading about bias and where it appears, thinking about your own personal spaces and how you interact and show up with others. The second is to acknowledge intent in interactions, but to focus on impact. yeah, it's important to know that maybe that wasn't intentional. But what's really important is to address the impact that a biased behavior may have had on an individual. Third, we want to be an active bystander in situations, whether at work or whether at home in other social contexts. You want to make sure that you feel as though you can support others who may be experiencing bias, and that you can bring education to others who may not be aware that they're expressing their bias in these ways. Tip number 4 is to really reflect on your social identities and how they show up in any given situation. And so this is an important practice of sort of self-reflection, even journaling about it, or whatever the case may be. And finally, 5th is focus on building inclusive communities. Again, this can be in the workspace, whether it's building that, that reporting algorithm or this process for how to report bias in the workplace, or how to address bias in the workplace and make everyone aware about it. Or whether it's at home, how do I make sure that, that everyone feels like they can be their best self at home? And that's a tall order. But I think you want to focus on building inclusive communities around you so that people feel as though they can belong. So I think, perfect, I left about 10 minutes for questions. I did want to end with asking, what one thing could you do? And I would love for folks to, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love for folks at this point to share in the chat box one takeaway that you might do in your own personal lives following today that you might bring to your workplace, whether it's thinking about the inclusive environment. I'm going to put pictures of scientists of color up on my wall at work, or whatever the case may be. If you could just share that in the chat box, I think it would be really good to get tips, take-home tips that we could all share with one another and reflect on how we might bring that moving forward. So we have one here. I love it. Speak up. Bring another resource to the table. I love that one. Standing up. I think that message has really come through loud and strong today. It's about standing up for others. Any other tips? Oh, I got some private messages. Sharing this at staff meetings, sharing it with others at staff meetings. Take the IAT, have others in the workplace take it. Become aware of my biases and provide opportunities for other people to become aware of their biases. Implementing a reporting system, I love that. Having open dialogue with others who may not share the same idea as me. Bringing in photos of diverse individuals, particularly within the disability world. Photos of younger faculty and staff up in the room. Oh, I love this all. Listening and supporting, volunteering, apologizing for your own personal microaggressions. And I love that because as we notice, it's harder for us to recognize our own microaggressions. I have some private chats about stepping in when you witness a microaggression, reflecting more, sharing what you learn, featuring works of minority, minority professionals in your setting. I love this all. Practicing nonviolent communication. Wonderful. And I realize that I've made it difficult for Tia because I love this and I'm getting all the chats, but this is also the point that we can ask questions. And so I don't know how we're going to disentangle that from the chat.
Well, I'll do my best. It's wonderful to have this community sharing. And would you like a few questions now?
Yeah, if folks have questions, and I'll monitor the chat too. So I will continue to share any cool tips that I see. But if you also have questions, now is a lovely time to ask them as well.
I'll just bring up a few that had been brought forth earlier. And one is a theme that was reflected in several people's questions, and that's that if the current environment is not reflecting the nation's diversity, what can be done to help bring the voice of those who are not in the community in the current complement of membership, so that the voices that are needing to be heard are being brought into the conversation. And then the subordinate to that larger umbrella point was how to help promote people who are of the diverse voice that is not currently present and to bring them into the conversation.
So I think I think that question in and of itself shows, what we should be doing. I think that there were a lot of answers within that question. But one thing that has really sort of been brought to the fore is the idea here around centering the voices of diverse individuals in our community, making sure that they are at the center of these conversations, and that when they want to be heard, when an individual wants to be heard and that voice needs to be heard, that we raise it. Oftentimes, good meaning upstanders might tamp it down and say, well, here is what I think. And what we want to make sure is that we are centering the voices of marginalized individuals in our society. And that question also gets to a larger point around making sure that there are there is a diverse makeup around us. And so that actually, a lot of you are focusing on the work environment. That actually starts in the workplace. Are we recruiting for diversity? Are we making sure that we have the diversity in our candidate pools that we need? Are we viewing our hiring processes in a way that will allow us to really make sure that diversity is a priority in those processes? And in terms of promoting the voices of diverse individuals, I think, yes, centering the voices of diverse individuals and really highlighting the work of diverse individuals in your programs. We talked about, putting pictures of women and people of color up in the halls around you. Well, making sure that the work is of diverse individuals in our surroundings is highlighted and is really brought to the fore.
Thank you. The large systemic work is the road ahead, and we appreciate this opportunity to be called into awareness of our own personal biases. One of the other themes that came up in the questions is that in some of the research that was shared, there were some further questions to be explored, which may or may not have been done by the researchers. For example, in the one where the faces of the individuals were shown and then the words were matched to the faces, the question was asked whether the participants' racial identity was collected to inform the researcher as to whether the identity was a variable as well as the perception.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, and it gets to the point about where the biases show up in societies around us. And yes, and actually on the IAT website, at the end of the IAT, they do ask you a series of demographic questions. They don't tie it to the overall rating that we gave, but there has been a lot of research in this area. And it comes up differently. It really depends on an individual's environmental context and where they are. So, for example, I mentioned women may hold the same stereotypes about women in science as men do. And there are actually studies that show that people of different races may hold negative stereotypes about their own race, just given the way society promotes those negative stereotypes. Now, they're not self-loathing. There's nothing harmful about individuals who hold these negative stereotypes about our own social identities, but it's just the way that bias sort of imprints on society. Now, on the flip side, you may have the reverse in those situations if you've grown up in a context that really celebrates the richness of the diversity. So it really is context specific, but it really is on how the bias shows up in society around you. So someone just mentioned, I'd like to use the best terms possible at all times, but I also, I feel like we do get sidetracked arguing about terms. And I think, is there advice about how to change the conversation to being about respectful on a genuine level and not just using the right terms? And I wholeheartedly agree with this, with the caveat that I do think that we want to be sure that we're always using respectful terms. We don't want to be using language that could be disrespectful. And so that's a process of self-education as well. And, so you just want to make sure that we're using respectful terms, but I just agree that we don't want to get hung up on the terms. And so I think the question around changing the conversation around one of respect would be really using the language of respect and using that language in the workplace, because we all really strive to be respected, to feel respect, and to give respect to others. And so I think that really using that language is accurate. However, we don't want to and I guess this is the appropriate word, but we don't want to whitewash these conversations. We want to make sure that in the environment around languages of respect, we're addressing the fact that we want environments of respect that are inclusive of folks of different diverse backgrounds, of people of color, of different abilities, of different genders. You do want to make clear the facets of diversity are really important. But so you don't want to just say respect and that's it. We want to say respect because we want to make sure that people from all of these diverse backgrounds feel that they can fully participate in our workplace.
We just want to give our heartfelt gratitude and appreciation to Dr. Fassiotto for all of her hard work in this pioneering arena of awakening to our unconscious biases and then applying it into tangible, compassionate, wise action. Thank you very much for your session today.